Hi, this is James. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to experiment with a new format and I'm going to do a bit of a more theoretical presentation. But instead of something like mainline theory, theory about an opening that occurs a lot in club practice but rarely at the grandmaster level. And this opening is called the Smith-Morra Gambit. This gave me a headache as a kid, and I've noticed that a lot of my students have been facing it, especially online. So first let's see what the Smith-Morra is. Okay, so probably many of you like to play the Sicilian defense, and I sure did. In fact, one of my favorite Sicilians starting out was the Dragon, which I think is a good Sicilian to learn when you're starting out. But what would happen is occasionally I'd face d4, and this gambit was c3. And I'd spend most of my time studying the Dragon, and then this would come up, and I had an opening encyclopedia that would recommend accepting, and I knew black should be better, but things never really worked out the way I'd hoped, and I'd get in a lot of trouble. So this is a dangerous gambit, and I'm going to show you how to accept the gambit. Well, really, today what I'd like to discuss is how my position on the Morra has evolved over time, over the past quarter of a century. Because the Morra has changed a lot since I was a kid. First, let's go back to c3. A lot of books may recommend that you decline the gambit, and I think that's what many amateurs do. It's simpler, but I want to address a few things, a few pitfalls if you don't do this carefully. Okay, if you really want to punish this gambit, you need to accept it, but there are ways to avoid difficulties by transposing to a different opening. So if you do decline it, I recommend that you play knight to f6 and transpose to a c3 Sicilian. White doesn't really have any better than pushing the pawn, and then we get typical transpositions after say this. Of course, White can play knight f3 here, but it's very similar. There'll be a transposition, so you need to study to knight f6 against the c3 Sicilian. That is c3 on the second move. Now, this could be a problem if you don't play knight f6 against the c3 Sicilian, and you could learn another line, but that is a lot of work. And also at the same time, it's going to be equality, okay, with best play. When White plays the Smith-Morra Gambit, he's inviting us to a sharp struggle, and frankly, when I play the Sicilian, I like to counterattack, and if White's giving me a chance to come out better, if I defend correctly, then that's rather enticing. The thing is you don't want to defend too passively. And before I move on, I want to mention a couple of things about declining, a few pitfalls that I commonly see. One is d5. I don't recommend you do this. It may be tempting if you play 2d5 against the c3 Sicilian. And I've played both, actually, knight f6 and d5. They're both good lines. The problem here is you don't get the transpositions you want in this line. It's just not as good. After taking, queen takes, after the pawn takes back on d4, the problem here is that you've committed to this capture, and this limits your options, and I think this is a favorable version for White. So I would avoid this. Now, there's an interesting thing that came up, a couple of moves. Black's not obligated to take with the queen. And in fact, there was a video on YouTube from the St. Louis Chess Club where Yasser Seirawan was giving a lecture on the Smith-Morra, and he mentioned this move knight f6, and he thought that this was essentially almost like a kind of refutation, and that it threw white completely out of his game. And yes, if white takes on d4 with the pawn, now you can take back the knight. It's a completely different story now. Okay, because the queen on d5 was vulnerable to attack, the knight wouldn't be. Okay, after something like this. I mean, this is a very nice isolated queen's pawn position. But I think the problem here is bishop b5. And he doesn't mention this, but this is just a heads up if you play this. Now, this might work well in blitz, but if you're playing a strong player, and if you check out the databases, well, white scores very well, I mean, 58% from this move. And if you notice that the strongest players that reach this position will nearly always play bishop b5. I think I've also seen queen a4 check. This is bishop b5 check is the top move of the engines, and they're giving a significant advantage to white. So just a heads up with that. I don't think it's equalizing. Another thing. Okay, so d5 you want to avoid. I don't recommend that. Another line that I've seen is d3, and this is quite tempting. Just give the pawn back, and then play for kind of a dragon setup usually. There's a very good book on the Smith-Morra Gambit by international master Mark Esserman. That although I don't play the Morra, I found it to be such a good book in preparing myself for the black pieces, because he even gives a number of good ideas for black. But I think he makes a pretty good case in his book that this structure is advantageous to white. And I can tell you, I like playing the white side of the Maratsi bind, and I think this is just a good version. It's a little different, but he gives a scheme with h3, knight f6, I mean knight f3, h3 avoids the pin, bishop g4, and I think white's very comfortable with slight advantage. So I don't think that equalizes. So I would, if you want to be safe, play knight f6 here. But I really think you can accept the gambit and play for more. And I think there are many ways to do it that are good. And I'm going to give my top 3 recommendations of this, and I'm going to show you the initial pitfalls I faced when I played this variation, based on book recommendations, and what to watch out for, and what I came to see as the best approaches against the gambit. So when I first played this gambit after knight takes c3, I played for this Scheveningen structure. And I can tell you I did not play the Scheveningen as black. I played the dragon, but I knew that's how you're supposed to develop. So we get this typical thing where white would develop with knight f3, I would play d6, and then white would make his typical developing move, and I would play e6. Okay, and quite a normal development. And one thing I just want to point out here is, okay, white would have his standard developing moves. This is a continuation that is mentioned in Esserman's book, and it just shows white's typical moves. I mean, it looks like white is just playing like by the book with the beginner, as a beginner would, and that's one of the appealing things at club level about this gambit is white can make just a lot of natural moves, and then the tactics can flow the position if black makes one wrong move. And one of the earliest players to play the Morra that was strong was Matulovich, and I'm just going to show you a sample game of illustrate the kind of pitfalls black can face with passive defense in this line. And it's very similar to experience I faced early on when I played the gambit. And I described this in the notes I made in this presentation, which I have posted on lichess in a study, which you can refer to afterwards. So in this game, Matilovic versus Brad Varevich, Sombor, Yugoslavia, 1957. Uh, Black played Queen C7, which is quite logical because White's introducing some ideas with E4. So okay, Black gets off the file, and then White brings his other rook. And this is a big difference between the Smith-Morra and the open Sicilian, is that White can put a rook on the c file opposite the queen. There's no pawn on c2. There's not really a target for Black. It's reversed. The situation's reversed, and this can be quite frustrating to Sicilian players. It can throw them totally off their game, as it did me. And okay, Black castles, bishop b3, just clearing the path for the rook. And now these tactics are opening up. And in the game, Black played rook d8, which it makes sense. I mean, adding more support, over protecting d6, maybe free the queen. To, maybe he wanted to get to a5 or something. But probably better was for him to just go back to b8. Okay, as awkward as it looks. But even then, this is like complicated. I mean, there's some lines that Esserman analyzes, which you have to consider. And that would be messy. So if we go back to bishop b3, okay, just to illustrate the dangers, already White has a thematic tactic, knight d5. And after the capture here, okay, the knight's pinned. And so White's going to get his piece back. It's kind of a pseudo-sacrifice. And here Black made a little bit of a dubious move, but he's already worse. And then White just got a clear advantage. And it became close to decisive soon. Again, using the pin, another pseudo-sack. Okay. And White's getting his material back, but his bishop persists. He has the bishop pair. The rooks are excellently placed. This is terrible, and White went on to win a nice game. So that's the kind of thing to avoid, like what we see here. Okay, this knight d5 idea, really dangerous. And that's where you can make a lot of natural Sicilian moves and then just end up in a depressing position. So that's something we want to avoid. Okay, so I had a number of frustrating experiences. I even had a master play this against me. And I played the dragon, and he just threw this on me. And again, I got in a passive position. So I had to find something. And eventually someone recommended back here at d6, okay, instead of e6 right away, this move a6. And today, this is often called the Taylor defense. At the time, there was a book out by international master Tim Taylor on how to defend against the Moor this way. And I think this is a very good defense. And this is the defense I've played for most of my career. One thing I want to mention here is one of the subtle points of a6 here can be it can be understood through the natural move knight f6. Knight f6 is perhaps an inaccuracy already. e5 is very annoying here. And just to illustrate the dangers, okay, Black's made these very natural moves, yet White can get a terrible initiative straight out of the opening. And there's this funny example of a game that was played in 2013 where a grandmaster, Majors, lost a Class A player in the first round of an open tournament. And he just fell into this trap. Maybe he wasn't aware of it, but what happened is okay, there's a queen trade. And White has this terrible initiative. After here, knight takes, okay, and the threats are just mounting. I mean, already after bishop e3 here, white's threatening checkmate. And black just ended up falling into a lost position. It's just kind of funny. There was a bit of a back and forth here where there was a potential for a perpetual. But black's already lost, it turns out. Black went to f6, but it just got worse. And okay, black played bishop c5 here, but and he resigned. Okay, so this is kind of thing to avoid. Okay, and you can play through that game in the notes, but this e5 move is very annoying. So if you notice at this point after the queen trade, knight b5. Okay, that was really dangerous. One of the points of the Taylor defense is to prepare knight f6 with a6. So b5 is covered. And you're not committing to e6 yet because it might even be useful to put the bishop on g4. And that's a nice nuance with this line. I consider this to be like this optimal move order. Almost, it's a very good system. Knight f6, and it's really common. Okay, as we saw in the game that Matulovich played, it's very common to put the queen on e2 and the rook on d1 to oppose the queen. It sets up these ideas with e5. Okay, the difference here, okay, is that after queen e2, bishop b4 is very good, and this is going to weaken white's control of the center. Once the bishops trade for the knight, the pin's quite useful. Usually, white will want to break the pin eventually. One thing I want to mention about order here: don't be tempted by bishop g4 here. You're not ready for it yet because the bishop's unprotected, and there's a standard tactic. Taking the pawn. Okay, we're winning the bishop back. Okay, that's why I need to play knight f6 first to execute this. And then, okay, after queen e2, so there are two books that I knew that covered this variation. One was the one by Tim Taylor, and then there was a book by Joe Gallagher on beating the anti-Sicilians. I think this was from Batsford a long time ago in the 90s. And this was a book I used a lot when I was a kid to study. And there was a game played by Daniel King that was very convincing victory from the black side. And it's a good model game if you want to see how to handle these positions. Just briefly, b1, e6, queen b8, getting off the file. Okay, so that's against e5 coming. H3, queen takes, and black eventually coordinated his forces and started to get his Sicilian counterplay. And this just went beautifully for black. There's a nice tactic here. Okay, you can review that game in the notes, but this is a model game for black. To give an idea of black's approach. So you kind of see that not only does this weaken white's control, but it eases black's cramp a bit. Okay, and if black can coordinate, he's doing quite well and should come out better. But things have changed in this variation more recently. In Esserman's book, instead of queen e2, he gives the move bishop f4. I think this is the main line today. And here, bishop g4 is not so simple. Just to warn you, if you play by analogy, it's a little trickier. And Esserman mentions some poisonous ideas just to show you. If h3 here, now you may notice that white's effectively gained a tempo here because he didn't do queen e2. He did bishop f4 first, and this makes a difference actually. And rook fd1, queen b8, similar type of moves, but there's kind of a nice idea here. Bishop e2. Okay, and this is actually, it looks really strange at first, but it's a kind of prophylaxis. It's preparing queen g3. And this idea is not so simple to counter. Okay, and the thing is maybe, I think objectively it's probably equal, but black is passive, and white has these interesting ideas like this exchange sacrifice that Esserman mentions, and white's getting a bit of pressure, like these bishops are kind of annoying. I'd rather not go in this variation, to be honest. It looks a bit passive to me. And when you see engine evaluations that are around 0, I'm a little uncomfortable with the side with extra material sometimes. And this is, especially when you're passive, that can be a sign of danger, and I don't care for this so much. So after this bishop f1 move, bishop, I recommend e6, but one thing I want to mention about bishop g4, there is a more ambitious approach you can consider, and that is bishop h5. And this was actually recommended recently by Mezgin Amanov. And this can be very complicated. Esserman devotes a lot of analysis to this line, and it gets very complicated. I also believe that g4 is another move too that's quite interesting as well. I would rather just not get into this stuff, but you're welcome to look into this. I mean, Ray Robson won a game in this line in 2014. But one thing I'll mention here is that what's interesting is that when Robson encountered this position again, he played e6 in 2017 last year, and he played for the Scheveningen setup. So this is one thing about this Taylor defense, is that you have flexibility. If bishop g4 isn't that great, you can switch plans and maybe aim for like an improved version of the Scheveningen structure I mentioned earlier. I mean, I think those are solid, but I think this is a way to some interesting play. And after queen e2, I think what's interesting here is knight h5. And what's notable about this move is that although it's not played very often, it was played by pretty strong grandmasters last year, including Robson, Malakato, and Mecking. So I'd keep, those are like 2,600 players. So I think this is an interesting approach, and if you want to play the Taylor fence, this is how I'd recommend you play. Now, that maybe could be another topic for a video. I'd say this is like my secondary recommendation. So that's my comment on d6 here. Okay, and the Taylor defense has served me well, but it does take some work, and this was recommended in Toshnik and Palliser's book, among others. So more recently, and it is a serious defense. And one thing I'll mention is this is probably one of the more popular tries, so you can expect maybe your opponent to be ready for this as well. So be prepared to do some work, but I think it is a good line. One thing that's kind of interesting is there's some other approaches. The Smith-Morra, it's almost like a parallel universe with like with the Open Sicilian, in that, okay, with all of Black's major setups, there's kind of like a similar setup against the Smith-Morra. They have little differences. So we were looking a lot at like Scheveningen, classical Sicilian types of setup. There are other setups like A good one is the dragon. I actually don't have a lot of experience about this, but if you want a reliable equalizer, I'd say this is maybe like my third recommendation. If you just want to keep things really simple, g6 is very solid. And after bishop g7, um, usually black is really good if he can get d6 in. So white at this moment needs to play e5 if he wants to play for something. Otherwise, I think he ends up being just worse. And I think objectively this is just equal, but this is a pretty reliable path to equality because black's structure is pretty solid. He's also fairly active, and I think it just kind of peters out the equality if both sides play correctly. And I think the safest move here is knight h6. So if you want a simple approach against the Morra, and say you're like one of these players that, okay, you don't play 2 knight f6 against a c3 Sicilian, you play, say, something like d5, and you want an easy to learn defense that just equalizes and you don't have to learn a whole lot, this is probably the way to go. I mean, I'll just caution you, e5 is justified by some tactics with taking and then playing queen f7. I mean, bishop f7 followed by queen d5. It's not, that's not a free pawn, and you can take it, and I think that's playable. But I think it's just safe to play knight h6 and a typical continuation after castles. Just give the pawn back. Okay, you're freeing up your position, and just to show how things could proceed. It's just like follows a line that Esserman gave, I think. He doesn't mention this, but h6 might be the best move here, and some examples of how play could proceed. Okay, just don't worry about keeping the extra pawn. Fight goes after the extra pawn. It usually leads to these mass simplifications. Trade, trade. This should be a draw. Okay. I know it's not that exciting, but Black should easily equalize because, I mean, if White doesn't win that pawn back, it's not like he's going to have a whole lot. And so if you complete your development like this, this is pretty reliable. You don't want to get too ambitious here. So let's go back to bishop c4. Okay, so the dragon's another way to play. Another thing that's interesting is that you can try like a Najdorf approach and even a Kahn approach with some ideas that don't even involve developing the knight on c6 that I found to be interesting. In fact, I used one for a while. I'll mention this briefly because this is interesting. There was this thin self-published paperback book by Bob Ciaffoni, I believe. And he was a national master, and he developed this system with Ben Feingold, and they call this the Feingold defense. And so he self-published this book, and the book described a scheme of development for black, kind of in a similar vein as the way black would develop like against the Fischer-Sozin attack. Just a really solid system, and just keeping the pawn, and it's very enticing. And for a while, I almost thought this was like a refutation of the Morra. I remember after reading this book, like I sometimes you just play bullet, and I just play these moves out really quickly, have a great structure, and just convert the pawn. This is a nice system, but unfortunately, I don't think it gives black any advantage with best play. But what I mean is, I think might get some pressure. So this is like a typical development. Black could play d5, and someone doesn't know this, they're probably going to retreat. Besserman even found these ideas with e5, and getting like this weird like, browser type of structure. And it turns out like white has a lot of play here. So if you go back to this, I mean, it looks funny making all these pawn moves while white's developing, but white's kind of going for the ideal setup against the Smith-Morra. It was ideal Sicilian setup, like when the Najdorf. But probably what black's most accurate move order is play b5 first, not to give that possibility. Maybe develop like this. I've seen some correspondence games that went along these lines. And I think this transposes to like one of the variations that was analyzed in that book. But Esserman did some analysis in his book to update this variation. And if you follow this like on Last Check on ChessBase, you kind of go down line. It follows Esserman's analysis pretty much. The queen, one of the awkward things is like where to put the queen, and the queen often goes to b7, and it almost looks like black's okay, and I think he is, but it's just white has this continual pressure. And just to follow his analysis a little further, you can see, I mean, okay, black has this extra pawn, he has solid structure, but white has to wave off the attack, and it's the kind of thing like it's really close. And I think if white slips up like slightly, black can end up being much better, but it's just you have to deal with this pressure, and I think objectively it's okay. And there's this crazy line that goes like this. This is just for your knowledge. I'm not going to go into detail, but yeah, there's this crazy line. It's like top engine moves, and so the Esserman gives c7, and this looks nuts, but yeah, blacks actually can survive. Yeah, I mean, okay, black can't take the rook because he'll just get mated. That's kind of funny. I mean, after the queen takes, that's made. Okay, so, and I mean, okay, rook e8 is like the only move, I think, and there's some weirdness. And that's one perpetual. Okay, it's the kind of variation like computer gives 0.0, and it looks like something from the poison pawn almost. Not my cup of tea. But that's the best play. So that's a playable variation. It's just that I'm hoping for more. I think what bothers me most is that black is so passive for like in some variations. So it's really close, but it's not my main choice today. Another thing I want to warn you, and this is in Palliser's book after e6, is the con approach with b5, e7. And actually, I'm going to recommend you this setup, but not what Palliser recommends. Okay, after castles, and in my notes I have this in a different move order, but if black plays knight c6 actually transposes to the main line in my notes, I think this is maybe black's best move. But in Palliser's book, he gives this tempting continuation. This is b4. It pretty much forces white to make a knight sacrifice. And I think the book, he makes a case, well, this is probably just unsound, and maybe you're refuting the Morra, but today it just doesn't hold up. Like, and I'm not even talking like practical chances white has. This line is maybe just busted. And knight d5 is just really strong here. And just to show you a line that I also recommended, okay, knight d4, king f8. I mean, you have these issues like knight f5 right away, and so you have to make an awkward move like king f8 just to survive. And you're really in a situation where you're making like only moves, and bishop f4 is strong here. This is mentioned by Palliser. And this is the kind of thing, like if you go back earlier in the line, like a few moves back, like right after the piece sacrifice, the computer might say, like it's supposed to equal. But this is a situation like always view such claims with skepticism by the computer, especially if you're up material. The other side has initiative. Because the deeper you go in this line, it's like the engine evaluation starts to go up. And it's like it's slightly better. And if you go deeper, it just grows and grows and grows. And okay, Palliser's idea here was after knight f5, okay, knight e5. I think it gives us an exclamation mark, and it's maybe the best move. But I mean, just shuts down black's play. I mean, white's play, but it's not the case. And it gives this move like queen d4, but you put this in the less check, and it's just right away bishop e5, and it's almost lost. So this is a really scary line, and I mean, look at black's king side. I mean, he's kind of playing with one arm tied behind his back, effectively, and even though white's a piece down, d6 is really strong. It's just black's play is so forceful. Rook c1. Okay, you're challenging the rook with rook c8. Connect the rooks. Queen d2. The top engine move here is knight h6, and that's like that's kind of a sign things are going wrong, and it just gets downhill. This is like a line that goes forward, but white has like a lot of pressure here, and these are all top engine moves. This is just to show the dangers. I mean, I'm not recommending you go in this line, but okay, black's probably already lost, and that's like these are all like top engine moves. So I would avoid that. Don't play before here. You want to develop first, and okay, it may seem strange. I'm recommending queenside development first before finishing your kingside development, but I'll get to that. Why I recommend that? Okay, so there's one thing. Okay, the move order I recommend, and you could use that con move order. I think it's just as good. Okay, knight c6 like before, and e6 now, and bishop c4. And what I think is funny is that if you go to left check, the top move from the engines is bishop e2. And I think that's maybe kind of an indication of the strength of e6. It's very logical. If your opponent's aiming to put the bishop on c4, it's nearly always a good idea to put the pawn on e6. Here, instead of going for d6, because one of the weaknesses with d6, as we saw, is, okay, e5 can free the pieces, and it's a bit annoying. So here, I can play a6. This is what I recommend. This is my main recommendation. And when I was reading Esserman's book, there's another move I played, and that was knight f6. And he actually gives this an exclamation mark in his book. I don't think it's the strongest move, though. And I'll just say briefly why. I played this once against an expert at the World Open, and he played castles here. And this is very natural. But it may not be the best because of this fort trick variation. And I don't think that's so good for white. And Esserman thinks this is strong. And it worked out pretty well in the game I played. Now, after queen e2, uh, this is probably the most accurate. Okay, it guards against this idea, and there's this Siberian trap thing that's kind of fun to play. I mean, you can catch your opponent and this surprising trap here. I'll just mention it briefly. Okay, queen c7, and it's best for white to play e5. One thing that white needs to avoid is this kind of thing, like with a blunder and then knight e4, and then white is lost. Because if knight takes, queen h2 mate. So that's the trap. That's the Siberian trap part of it. And there are other aspects of it too, but I felt like e5, this idea was the strongest. And okay, after knight g4, bishop f4, d5. Okay, so I think this was like one of Esserman's main recommendations for black. Okay, this is a line I just want to caution you about, because if you're analyzing this with an engine, it may give black like a significant advantage at first. But as you go deep in the line, white has this pressure, and even though it's like this sort of French style position, I think white has serious compensation. And I just can't recommend this because I think it's too risky. There was a line I was looking into that is given in Retsky's book on the Sicilian, in this crazy h5 idea, and that is interesting, but I don't trust it. And I did a lot of analysis on this, and I just think it's too crazy. I'm not really sure it's correct either. So I'm recommending the Taimanov approach, A6. And this was an approach that was recommended recently on chess24.com by the Spanish Grandmaster Ivan Salgado. After b5 was his recommendation. And one thing I want to mention here is that there's a defense that's had some popularity. It's knight ge7, and this is recommended like in a lot of old sources. A number of grandmasters have played this. Esserman calls this the move the professional's choice, and I don't recommend you do this right away. And I'm just give you an example. This is an introduction of Esserman's book, and I think this really boosted his book, that he beat Loic van Wely with this system, and he describes the experience. It's sort of funny to read about, but yeah, okay. Yeah, black's idea here is to put the knight on g6. Okay, so you don't have to worry about these e5 ideas. And then you can get the bishop out to e7 and castle, usually. But it's not that simple, maybe. And here, Van Wely played b5. And if I remember correctly, Esserman was talking about how he faked thinking here uh, to not let his opponent know that he had analyzed this carefully beforehand. And after he made the move, Van Wely just snapped off the piece. But he fell under tremendous pressure, d6, and this just kind of cuts the board in half. And this got really bad. I mean, beautiful game. But this is a cautionary. You gotta take this seriously. I mean, already, this is pretty much over for black. And that's quite a way to beat Van Wely. Okay, so This is dangerous. Keep in mind, this came up earlier, this knight d5 move. Okay. Because the setup I'm going to show you, my main recommendation, what Salgado recommends, it is prepares against this in an interesting way. First, you start with the queenside development. You leave things as they are. You have a really solid structure. This kind of buys you time, and you wait for white to disclose his intentions while you get your queenside counterplay underway. So you're ready to counter him at the right moment. And this sounds really dangerous, but I think it's the way to go. And it takes some courage to play this way, but I think this can be very rewarding. And what I like about this is that you aren't passively defending against a sacrifice; that you're actually you're getting active counterplay in return. So it's one of these things that I think it's a smart idea. Um, and okay, there's kind of a game that inspired Salgado. This was a game played by Game Magani, an Iranian grandmaster, and he found this improvement that gives black a clear advantage, and I think it's a very instructive game. So I'm going to show this quickly. Um, yeah, so Queen E2 is one of White's major moves, and when I was researching this line, what I found interesting here was that A4 had been played. And this might be one of the most testing lines, provoking B4, and then knight D5. This is actually stronger than doing knight D5 right away. And I may go into more details about this in another video. But I think this is a critical line. And of course, you don't want to accept the knight. But what we're going to do here is we're going to use this knight here, and we're going to play to A5. And okay, white. This may look a little scary at first, but we're flexible. Okay. This kind of reminds me of Bruce Lee's words, be like water, my friend. Um, Water can crash and water can flow. And you adapt to the circumstances. Okay. Um, Here, this is maybe White's best. And the way this is between Emmanuel Berg and Kai Rulin. Okay, and Berg is like was 2550 at the time, and Kai Rulin's like 2650. So this is like one of the highest level games in the Morra I've seen actually. And in the game, Black played f6, but I think an improvement here is d5, and I think that Black is a little better here. I think Black can play for an advantage, and this shows the flexibility of not committing to f6 right away. This was an interesting idea that I think deserves more analysis, and I may cover more detail in the video. I consider it to be a critical line. It wasn't covered in Salgado's video, but I plan to go in more details about it. So after Queen E2, Knight G7, so only now Knight G7. Okay, and then we have Knight E5 ready. We're hitting the bishop, so White moved his bishop away in this game. One thing to note is that if we go back here, White could also play Rook 81, but Black is doing fine. Just take the bishop, chase, and should be fairly safe. I mean, Black has the bishop pair, but White's development, I mean, it may look a little scary, but Black, I think, is quite safe. And I think there's a case to be made that Black has an advantage. Just to show an idea in this position, if White goes for Knight D4, this is the thing, you're pretty well guarded against White's breaks. E5 just doesn't have the same sting. And another thing, yeah, the bishop can be quite useful, as we'll see. So after knight d4, a strong move. This is not so obvious. Knight g6 is decent here, but maybe even strongest is king f7. This looks a little weird at first, but this can be understood if you look at b4. b4 is a blunder. This is a tactic to avoid because knight bd6 is really strong. And the idea is that after this trade, white's kind of stuck. I mean, black's kind of stuck here. The queen c6, rook c1's winning. The queen is just trapped. Okay, if it goes a6, knight c7, for instance. And if we go back to king f7 kind of corrects this. So that say if for now we can play b4, and now this tactic doesn't work. We've gotten out of the difficulties that we had earlier when the king was on e8. For instance, the queen can go to a6. You don't have to worry about knight c7. So this is good variation, and black has a clear advantage here, actually, if you go a little further. And white has these active moves, but I'm sorry. Yeah. So, okay. All right. So after bishop c2, so we develop queen e2, knight g7, bishop g5, knight a5, bishop c2. Then we can chase the bishop away. And the way the sample game went is bishop f4. Also analyzed bishop e3, and typical development here. Put the bishop on e7. If white tries to chase this knight, this is sometimes an idea you see white play. We can go to queen c7, opening up ideas of knight f4. And if he tries to cover it, okay, you can castle, like in the main game, and this maybe gives black an advantage, but the queen c7, queen d2. There's another interesting idea, h5, which may even be stronger. And one of the key points is see when you can play knight c4. And this wouldn't have been possible if you're castled, because then the queen could take on d7. But funny thing here is I think black's just better. g3, there's this pin that's annoying. And if white tries to prevent the pin, what's quite surprising is this f5 idea, which is pretty low. And the idea is that if he takes, you take on f6. If he takes the bishop, you get a winning attack. Okay, and if he takes, okay, if we go back here and takes the knight, okay, we can take the rook, and okay, we have to defend against that. So come out better, well, winning actually, like a decisive advantage. So that was interesting. Another, okay, if we go back to queen c2, I mean bishop c2, f6, bishop f4, knight g6, bishop g3, knight, okay, rook c8. So okay, we chase the bishops back, then we put the rook on c8. This is the typical routine in this variation. Okay, and white played rook a c1, black played bishop c5. And so what I like about this is black's starting to get his own active development. And white tried to exploit the knight on g6, just castled. In the game, after h5, black played knight e7, and there was a game played by Mossadegh 2474 against Game Magani 2577 in Tehran, 2016. So it's a fairly recent game, and Here, knight e7 is actually not the strongest. The game ended in a draw. But black can even improve on this with active defense. This is what I like about this line is that um, you're building leverage for the pawn and you're ready to give it back to activate your pieces. Your pieces like these bishops are quite nice, and I mean your rooks have prospects too. So um, it's kind of like a best of both worlds kind of thing. Like knight, so 95 is an improvement that Salgado found, and black is just better here. And one of the points is that knight takes is not really that good because knight c4 is just strong. Okay, so you see that 4 on on b2 and e5. And if we go back, better is bishop taking, and then take with the knight. Then we guard d7. Okay, white plays queen g4 with the top move, and then queen e7. So black has made a few defensive moves, but now is ready to initiate counterplay. And by giving back the pawn, you've opened the f-file. So you have ideas with that. You even have some tactics on f2. And also you have ideas if you see how the knight and bishop are lined up. There's some ideas exploiting this issue, like the bishop's undefended. So already, like, white is having some tactical difficulties. And maybe white's best move is just to retreat, okay, to try to solve some of these problems. For instance, if we go back and white plays bishop d3, one interesting tactic is takes f2, and the point is after the exchanges, you have this check. You come out pawn ahead. I think white's best is just to play queen f4, and then it'll lead to an endgame where black's a pawn up, just a clear advantage. And if we go back, let's say white tries to add extra protection to f2 with rook e2. I mean, it seems logical, covering the loose bishop and the f2 pawn. There's a strong counter to this, d6. So the knight is also a tactical liability. It's not stable, and after the knight moves back, knight c4 is really strong, and I think black has a decisive advantage already. So this is a serious problem. So white's best is knight f3, and one thing I thought was interesting is like, okay, black can put pressure with bishop b4 with a typical continuation, like using the bishop pair, where okay, black has like a slight advantage, I think, but maybe even more ambitious is bishop a3. But this is kind of nice. The rook comes in. This is pretty forceful. And one tactical sequence I analyzed, h6. One thing here, you actually don't often want to play g6. Something better just to leave this pawn here because it can be useful actually to challenge it later. 95. And this is one thing, okay, where here, this is one where we probably want to just hold this at the moment, but I think we come out much better. So we can play queen f6 now. Okay. And that way we're not stuck with that pawn on h6, and maybe the best white can do is just trade everything off. But with these passed pawns, black is just better. So this is some analysis I had on this variation. This is a start, but hopefully this will give you some ideas. But this is the way I would summarize like my main recommendations. Okay, so against the Smith-Morra, I recommend top recommendation is e6. Okay, depose the bishop. This is a really great setup. And what we're going to do here is before knight g7, we're going to get our queenside counterplay underway. Okay, this bishop can be useful, and also the knight can be very useful with a5. And we have a simple plan. Okay, after bishop g5, we chase the bishop, we chase the other bishop, and we get the rook to c file. And we're ready to develop our bishop on c5 or bishop e7. It might depend on where, like if white's bishop is on a3, we'll probably develop it on e7, though sometimes d6 can even be a possibility with the queen on c7. So I think this is very solid, and maybe I'll do another video analyzing some more detail. And lastly, okay, so this is my first recommendation. My secondary recommendation is the Taylor defense, which I used for a long time. And first you play a6. Don't do knight f6 because of e5. And then develop the knight. If they go queen e2, you're ready to play bishop g4. But if they develop a bishop f4, doing bishop g4 now is more complicated. And I would recommend e6 and play along the lines of Robson, okay, knight h5. And this is maybe could be a subject of another video. And my third recommendation, if you want to be super safe, still accept there's a safe way to accept the gambit, and that's just the dragon. Okay, and then okay, if white knows what he's doing, he's going to push e5 before you can play d6. But not to worry, just develop the knight and break with d6. You're going to give back, and you'll just leave a lot of simplifications, but you're safe. So those are my 3 recommendations, and we'll talk about this later. If you want to see more, please comment. I'm going to put a link to my analysis and the description on lichess, and feel free to comment. Okay, bye.